Question number 9, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. Would he act to further regulate Crown financial institutions if they were found to still be directly or indirectly investing in companies involved in the manufacture of cluster bombs, nuclear weapons, landmines, tobacco or whaling?
And before I call the Minister, my officers have been advised this answer may be longer than normal in an attempt to fully inform the member. The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, no. And I'd just like to explain briefly for the member how the independent investment activities of CFIs are already subject to a range of requirements for ethical investment. Each CFI runs an exclusion list that prevents direct investment in the companies on those exclusion lists. All of the activities the member asked about are excluded by these lists. CFIs may also invest in what are called collective investment vehicles, CIVs. Most recent figures show that CIV investments are a small proportion, around 3% of ACC and New Zealand Super and 13% of GSF portfolios, which total just short of $70 billion. If a CFI learns that a collective investment vehicle has invested in a company on its exclusion list, that is the investing in the activities the member referred to, the CFI will engage with the fund manager to try and influence their behaviour or consider divestment. Finally, all CFIs are signatories to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment and have adopted the UN Global Compact. These require signatories to establish a responsible investment framework which is subject to the following statutes and resolutions: the New Zealand Nuclear Free Zone Disarmament and Arms Control Act 1987, the Cluster Munitions Prohibition Act 2009, the Anti-Personnel Mines Prohibition Act 1998, and 2 UN Security Council resolutions regarding nuclear weapons.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
So, given all of that, is he saying that it is acceptable for the government to indirectly invest and profit from companies that manufacture cluster bombs that blow the legs off children?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we would expect the fund who became aware of an investment in one of the excluded activities would then take the action required to comply with their own rules. That is to either influence, in this case, a collective investment vehicle that may be investing at 1 or 2 arm's lengths in such activities, or to divest.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Is he aware that the Government Superannuation Authority continues to invest in 3 tobacco companies, even though the authority itself has found these companies unethical, and isn't it time to make the law clearer?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, I think the law is pretty clear, and the super fund should comply both with the law and with an ethical investment framework, which I'm advised is one of the most developed among sovereign funds in the world.
Speaker.
A point of order, James Shaw.
Just for clarity, I was referring to the Government Superannuation Authority, not the super fund.
My difficulty is the member actually asked 2 questions. He then also asked, is it not time to make the law clearer? And the Minister immediately addressed that. So he's answered one of the legs, and that's enough to satisfy. Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Does he agree with the ACC Investment Fund's position statement stating that they think indirect investments in cluster bombs manufacturers are perfectly legal?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we would expect them to comply both with the statute that creates a framework for their investment decisions and with any undertakings that they have made, as I said, as signatories to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. And I think the member would probably give credit to these organisations that as and when issues are raised regarding investment in companies that are on the exclusion list, from what I've seen, in each case the funds have acted appropriately.
Supplementary question.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, James Shaw.
Yes, I seek leave to table the ACC Investment Fund's position statement on investment in cluster bombs obtained under the Official Information Act.
Is it freely available on the ACC website?
No, sir, we couldn't find it on the website.
On that basis, I'll put the leave sought to table that particular position statement. Is there any objection? There is none. It can be tabled.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Isn't it a double standard for the government funds to continue to invest indirectly in cluster bomb makers, for example, when the KiwiSaver providers immediately dropped their indirect investments?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't use that term. Well, in the first place, I'm not exactly sure if what the member says has actually happened. Secondly, in respect of the Crown financial institutions, we would expect them, as I said, to act consistently with the statute and with the general, general expectations around the United Nations principles and so on. And if it is the case that ACC are not complying with those, then that would be a matter of governance, which I'm sure would be raised with them.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Mr. English, is it ever okay to fund cluster bombs?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, no, but I don't think that's the issue here. The issue here is how these financial institutions deal with the situation where much of the taxpayers' or levy payers' funding they have is invested indirectly, often at 2 or 3 arm's lengths from the New Zealand decision maker. That is invested in vehicles, collective vehicles, who are then investing in further collective vehicles. We would expect them to have the systems that enable them to know be able to track their investments and respond consistent with the framework in a way that I think the member and the government will probably agree on.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
So given that when the New Zealand Herald broke the story a few weeks ago about KiwiSaver investments, indirect investments in these kinds of companies, how come it was that they were able to move within a matter of a few days and yet the government funds don't seem to have been able to find that information?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, I can't answer that question directly. It's, I think, safe to say that KiwiSaver funds managers made statements within a few days. Just whether they've been able to divest, I think, is another matter that you'd have to check up with them. But we would expect the Crown financial institutions to act in a way that's consistent with their own ethical investment practices and with the statutes that govern them.
Question